Hi guys, we are the Group 9 and today we are going to talk about the Philippine Constitution. Hi, my name is Nicole Shane Kotamora and for today we will be talking about the importance of the Constitution and we will also have the rundown about the different constitution that were implemented in our country. So first, what is the definition of Constitution? So the meaning of Constitution, it is the fundamental principles and laws of nation, state or social group that determine the power and duties of the government and guarantee the certain rights of the people. So when we talk about the Constitution, this is the foundation of the system of the government. So ang ibig sabihin nito, nandito lahat kung paano papatakbuhin ng isang bansa or mapapamunuan ng binibigyan na pagkakataon na mapaunlad at mapatakbo ang sarili nito. Our Constitution also establishes the power of the government. It can define, limit, and distribute the powers and function of the government. So next, let's talk about the function of the Constitution. So a Constitution establishes the framework for government, which is critical for ensuring that everyone's interests and demands are addressed. It establishes how laws are formed and explain how the government operates. So, the meaning of this is that the function of the Constitution, this establishes the basic framework and underlying principles of government. In short, this is the basis of making laws. Wala po tayong batas na pwedeng gawin na hindi tumutugma sa sinasabi ng ating Constitution. Ibig sabihin, kung magkakaroon man tayo ng isang government, dapat nakabatay sa kung ano ang nilalaman ng ating Constitution. So, for the case of 1987 Constitution, we have a democratic state as prescribed by the Philippines Constitution na ginagamit natin ngayon. So, next. So, how can we say that the Constitution was well written? So, first, it should be broad because it should be comprehensive. Kailangan nito na maipaliwanag ng mabuti ang nilalaman ng Constitution. And next is, kailangan siyang brief para kailangan din itong direct to the point, which leads to the definite. It should be definite because it would help to prevent confusion and misinterpretation by people. So, next, let's talk about the evolution of the Philippine Constitution. So, the number one is the Constitution of Biak na Bato 1897. So, this Constitution was promulgated on November 1, 1897 as part of the Philippine Revolution ni Emilio Aguinaldo. This was made by Isabelo Artacho and Felix Ferrer. So, the Biak na Bato Constitution provided the establishment of a Supreme Council that would serve as the highest governing body of the Republic. So, ang Constitution na ito ay ginawa noong November 1, 1897 at tumagal lamang ito ng isang buwan. So, natapos ang Constitution na ito, Constitution na Biak na Bato, after sumuko nila Emilio Aguinaldo at naitapon sa Hong Kong. After ng Philippine Revolution ng independence natin, nagkaroon tayo ng Constitution na tinatawag na Malolos Constitution.
Let us discuss the Malolos Constitution 1899. The Malolos Constitution was the basic law of the first Philippine Republic. It is the first important Filipino document ever produced by the people's representative. It is the first Philippine Constitution. It was drafted and adopted by the first Philippine Republic, which lasted for 3 years, from 1899 to 1901. The Malolos Constitution 1899 is rooted in democratic traditions that ultimately had their roots in American soil. It created a Filipino state whose government was a popular, representative, and responsible, with three distinct branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The Constitution placed limitations on supervise the freedom of actions by the chief executive, which would have hamper rapid decision making. The purpose of this Constitution is to limit the power of the government such that the rights of the citizens are protected from the government abuse. The Malolos Constitution was written by Felipe Calderon y Roca and Felipe Buencamino as an alternative to a pair proposal of the Malolos Congress by Apolinario Mabini and Pedro Paterno. The Political Constitution of 1899, informally known as a Malolos Constitution. On June 12, 1898, is the Declaration of Independence and Transformation of the Dictatorial Evolutionary Government on June 23 from Spain. The Malolos Congress election was held between June 23 and September 10. On September 15, 1898, the Revolutionary Congress convened in Baraswain Church in Malolos, with Pedro Paterno as the president and Gregorio Araneta as a vice president. On September 29, the June 12 Declaration of Independence was ratified. The Congress then decided to draft the Constitution, a decision opposed by Apolinario Mabini, the Prime Minister of the Evolutionary Government. On November 29, 1898, the resulting of Malolos Constitution was ratified and signed into law on December 23 and approved on January 20, 1899, sanctioned by President Emilio Aguinaldo on January 21 and promulgated on January 22. How did Malolos started? The Malolos Constitution was the basic law of the first Philippine Republic. It is the first important Filipino document ever produced by the people's representative. It is the first Philippine Constitution. It was drafted and adopted by the first Philippine Republic, which lasted for 3 years from 1899 to 1901. So, that is the Malolos Constitution 1899. So let us discuss what is the acts of the U.S. Congress in 1902 to 1934. During the American occupation, the Philippines was governed by the laws of the United States of America. Organic acts were passed by the United States Congress for the administration of the government of the Philippine Island. The first act was the Philippine Organic Act of 1902, which provided for Filipino citizens. Organic Act is one of this country's most important statutory directives addressing the protection of our natural and cultural heritage. It provides a strong sense of purpose and directives to those who manage the parks and to those who love and visit them. Second was the Philippine Autonomy Act of 1916, which included the first pledge of Philippine independence. This law served as Constitution of the Philippines from 1902 to 1934. This law created the first fully elected Philippine legislature. The law was enacted by the 64th United States Congress on August 29, 1916, and contained the first formal and official declaration of the United States federal government's commitment to grant independence to the Philippines. The last act is the Tidings-McDuffie Act, also called Philippine Commonwealth and Independent Act 1934. The U.S. statute that provided for a Philippine independence to take effect on July 4, 1946, after a 10 years transitional period of Commonwealth government. The purpose of the act is to provide for the complete independence of the Philippine Island, to provide for the adoption of a constitution and a form of government for the Philippine Island. In 1934, the United States Congress passed the Philippine Independence Act, which set the parameters for the creation of the Constitution for the Philippines. The act mandates the Philippine legislature to call for an election of delegates for a constitutional convention to draft a constitution for the Philippines. The 1934 Constitutional Convention finished its work on February 8, 1935. The Constitution was submitted to the President of the United States for certification on March 25, 1935. It was in accordance with the Philippine Independence Act of 1934. So, that's all. Thank you.
The 1935 Constitution or the Commonwealth Constitution. Commonwealth Constitution kasi ito ay noong panahon ng mga Amerikano. This constitution was a transitional constitution. Transitional constitution kasi noong panahon ng mga Amerikano under sa Tidings-McDuffie Law, binigyan ng Amerika ang leaders ng Philippines ng 10 taon na i-rule ang country, and if mapatunayan nila na kaya nilang i-rule ang country, then the US would grant the Philippines independence. So transition kasi from a dependent nation, magiging independent state na siya. This constitution is an American-inspired constitution which provided legal basis for the Commonwealth government of the Philippines. Under sa constitution na ito, there had been a definite territory of the Philippines under the Treaty of Paris. Sa Treaty of Paris, ipinaubayan ng Kingdom of Spain sa US ang territory ng Philippines, pero except sa mga island na hindi under sa control ng US like the island of Cagayan, Sulu, and Cebu. Sa panahon na ito, the Philippines was a nation but not a state because it did not have sovereignty, which means pwede pa rin siyang makontrol ng outside control, which was the US. This constitution provided a unicameral legislature. One legislator means isa lang, so ito lang yung National Assembly, a lawmaking body composed of 120 representatives. The president and the vice president under this constitution were elected for a 6-year term without re-election. In 1940, this constitution was amended. From a unicameral legislator, naging bicameral legislator na siya. So, ang lawmaking bodies were the Senate and the House of Representatives. After it was amended, it created an independent electoral commission, and it limited the term of office for the president and vice president from 6-year term without re-election, naging 4-year term na siya with 1 re-election. This constitution introduced the right to suffrage or the right to vote. Kasi noong panahon ng Commonwealth, yung mga lalaki lang na 21 years old above na kayang bumasa at magsulat ang pwedeng magboto, pero under this constitution, pati na rin ang women, pati na rin ang mga babae ay pwedeng bumoto. On February 8, 1935, this constitution was approved by the CONCON or the Constitutional Convention, and on March 25, 1935, it was ratified by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was an American lawyer and politician who served as the 32nd President of the United States, the President of the United States when the U.S. colonized the Philippines. On September 16, 1935, Manuel L. Quezon was elected president. And in December 30, President Quezon issued Executive Order No. 134 Series of 1937, approving the adoption of Tagalog as the language of the Philippines and declared and proclaimed the national language based on the Tagalog dialect as the national language of the Philippines. This constitution was the first constitution to be fully implemented, but meron pa ring problema because it was interrupted by the Japanese occupation in the Philippines when World War II broke out. The 1935 Preamble. The 1943 Constitution. So after the Americans surrendered to the Japanese colonized the Philippines, which gave birth to a new constitution, the 1943 Constitution. Premier Hideki Toho Si Hideki Toho was an Imperial Japanese Army general and Prime Minister of Japan through most World War II, most famous for his attack on Pearl Harbor. He promised independence in 1942 and the Kalibapi or Kapisanan ng Paglilingkod sa Bagong Pilipinas formed the PCPI or the Preparatory Committee for Philippine Independence. Itong PCPI, it was the one who drafted this constitution. So, ang 1943 Constitution was ratified by the Kalibapi on September 7, 1943. This constitution was a republican constitution and it had a strong executive power, subordinate legislative, and judicial branches. Si Jose P. Laurel ang appointed president by the National Assembly, which was the lawmaking body of this constitution. The legislature is a unicameral assembly again kasi nga 'di ba dun sa 1935 constitution naging unicameral siya and then pinalitan ng bicameral, and dito sa 1943 balik na naman siya sa unicameral and ang National Assembly ang lawmaking body. Sa panahon ng 1943, sa panahon na under ng 1943 Constitution, only anti-US can run for elections. This constitution was only recognized legitimate and binding by areas in the Philippines that were under the Japanese control. Kasi yung mga areas na hindi kontrolado ng Japan, hindi nila kilala itong 1943 Constitution as the new Constitution. Therefore, it was not recognized by the US government. This Constitution was a short-lived Constitution kasi the Americans came back and thus the 1935 Constitution was restored. A few years later, the Americans gave us the freedom. And after the Philippines got the freedom, many former presidents ruled our country with the 1935 Constitution as the Constitution of the Philippines until Marcos came. The 1973 Constitution. So, Marcos became a president on December 30, 1965, and in 1969 he was re-elected as president and was alleged of overspending and use of government funds during campaign periods. So, under the Marcos government, there was a plan to create a new constitution where delegates are elected to a constitutional convention. And finally, the CONCON delegates election happened on November 20, 1970. So, kasi nga 'di ba dun sa 1943 Constitution, nung binigay na ng Amerika ang independence sa Pilipinas, yung mga sumunod na presidente, they ruled the Philippines using the 1935 Constitution. Pero under sa presidency ni Marcos, he saw the importance of having a constitution free of signs of foreign colonization. Under sa presidency ni Marcos, the president was the chief executive of the Philippines. The Batasang Pambansa with not more than 200 members had the legislative power, and the Supreme Court was vested the judicial power. This constitution, the 1973 Constitution, was controversial for removing presidential term limit. On September 21, 1972, before the end of Marcos' last term, he declared martial law because of rampant corruption and growing communist insurgency. But according to critics and victims of the martial law, this was done to influence the ongoing constitutional convention. The martial law was provided under Article 7, Section 11, and it says that martial law can be declared when public safety requires. The Constitutional Convention wrote a constitution according to what Marcos wanted. This became the 1973 Constitution. For the first time in the Philippines, there was a parliamentary form of government, a form of government where there is a clear differentiation between the head of the government and the head of the state, where the prime minister being the head of the government and the president being the head of the state. In the parliamentary system, there is a fusion of powers between the executive and the legislative branches. The legislative powers were vested in a unicameral National Assembly elected by the people. Under this constitution, all the decrees, proclamations, and orders of the president were legalized. There were a total of 4 amendments in this constitution, with the 1976 amendment being the most controversial one. Why? First, the National Assembly was replaced by the interim Batasang Pambansa. Second, the president became the prime minister. Therefore, Marcos became the head of the government and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and also the head of state, and he was the one to exercise all legislative powers until the martial law was lifted. The 1980 amendment extended retirement age of members of judiciary to 70 years. The 1981 amendment modified parliamentary system into French-style semi-presidential system with a president and a prime minister, and the 1984 amendment abolished the executive committee and restored the position of vice president. Under this constitution, the executive power was restored to the president, and direct election of the president was restored as well. The final form of this constitution was the abolition of the Senate. The House of Representatives became known as Batasang Pambansa, departments became ministries, cabinet secretaries to cabinet ministers, and executive secretary to prime minister. When Ninoy Aquino came back to the Philippines and got assassinated, it caused mass outrage that forced Marcos to hold the snap election. A snap election is a kind of election where it is administered before the set date. So pinaaga. So Marcos called for a snap election, and Aquino ran for president, and former Senator Salvador Laurel as a running mate for vice president. The results of this snap election were controversial, and then we had the People Power 1, where Marcos got exiled and Cory Aquino became the president, and then the 1973 Constitution was abolished, and then came the Freedom Constitution.
Hello everyone, my name is Charlene Habagat, and in this video, I'm going to discuss the 1986 Constitution to 1987 Constitution. Let's start with 1986 Constitution. The 1986 Constitution is also known as the Freedom Constitution. So what is the 1986 Constitution all about? The 1986 Constitution is declaring a national policy to implement the reforms mandated by the people, protecting their basic rights, adopting a provisional constitution, and providing for an orderly transition to a government under a new constitution. On March 25, 1986, newly installed President Corazon Aquino issued Proclamation No. 3 abolishing the 1973 Constitution. The Parliament, the Supreme Court, the office of the Prime Minister, and all national and local positions, creating a revolutionary government under what she called the Provisional Constitution of the Republic of the Philippines. So during the Marcos era, the Filipinos cried for change. Change not just for the president, but for the change that is addressed to the government and to the entire country itself. And when Cory Aquino became a president, she abolished the 1973 Constitution and replaced it with 1986 Constitution. Why is it formed, and what is the purpose of the Constitution? The purpose was to reorganize the government and create a constitutional commission to make a formal constitution for the Philippine government after the Marcos era. In 1986, a constitutional convention was created composed of 48 members, appointed by President Aquino from varied backgrounds and representations. The convention drew up a permanent constitution, largely restoring the setup abolished by Marcos in 1972. The new constitution was officially adopted on February 2, 1987. Here are the three salient features in the 1986 Freedom Constitution. First, it was the verbatim copy of the 1973 Constitution minus the provisions on the Batasang Pambansa was completely abolished. Second, the country was in chaos of Marcos left, so Aquino vested in herself both executive and legislative powers, the same powers that Marcos exercised under the 1973 Constitution. Third, it was just a transitional constitution that lasted for a year, and a new commission was the 1987 Philippine Constitution, sometimes known as the Anti-Marcos Constitution. So what is the purpose of the 1987 Constitution? The 1987 Constitution established a representative democracy with power divided among three separate and independent branches of government, which are the executive, a bicameral legislature, and the judiciary. The Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy, adopts the generally accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land, and adheres to the policy of peace, equality, justice, freedom, cooperation, and amity with all nations. Now, the 1987 Philippine Constitution revolved around four themes. First, upholding of national sovereignty. Second, democratic governance and the prevention of another dictatorship. Third, respect for human rights and civil liberties. And last, the promotion of social justice. It's not a perfect document, but it is the country's highest law, binding all the citizens of the Philippines. The 1987 Constitution provided for three powers, namely the executive branch, legislative branch, and judiciary branch. The power of three branches are separated from one another. This is what we call separation of powers, and it also has a system of check and balances. In this system, each branch has the power to check, to restrain, or to stop the action by the other branches. This is to prevent any one of them by becoming too powerful. That's all. Thank you for listening.